Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Press freedom is a hot topic of debate just now in the release last week, following the release last week of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Press freedom continues to be struck down around the world, and perhaps nowhere more conspicuously in the last few years than in Hong Kong, as part of a wider crackdown on freedom of speech and democracy. In 2020, businessman, major figure in the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement and newspaper proprietor Jimmy Lai was arrested on allegations that he had breached the territory's new national security law. He remains in prison and faces spending the rest of his life there. Campaigning to highlight his father's plight and the crackdowns on democracy and press freedom in Hong Kong, Sebastien Lai is visiting Australia this week alongside human rights lawyer Caoilfhionn Gallagher KC. They will both address us today. Joining them on the stage is Jennifer Robinson, who's the lawyer who has acted for Julian Assange for the last 14 years. She will join the panel discussion after Sebastien and Caoilfhionn have spoken. Please welcome them all to start with. And Sebastien will address us first.
Hello. I know I come at an interesting time for Australia with relationships thawing in China. So my father's story to some is a uncomfortable and inconvenient one, but to some others I hope is an enlightening one. My father arrived in Hong Kong when he was 12 on the bottom of a fishing boat. He stowed away from communist China. He worked his way up in a glove factory, originally working as a child labourer, to eventually found the clothing brand Giordano, which I know some of you would have worn. And that was all well and good until 1989, when the pro-democracy protests were flourishing across China. He was very hopeful. He thought, if I could do what I did with the freedoms of Hong Kong, can you imagine if these freedoms flourish across China, how the lives of the people there would change for the better? As we all know, with hindsight of history now, that was not to be. The Tiananmen Square crackdown happened, and it was a real political awakening for many people in Hong Kong. My father decided to do something about it. He thought, with Hong Kong being handed over to China in 1997, that there needed to be a newspaper, a media group, that stood for the values of free speech, free press, of democracy, a newspaper that wasn't scared to speak truth to power. He knew that, and he always said it, that information is choice and choice is freedom. So with that in mind, he founded Next Magazine and Apple Daily. And right from the start, he's had multiple threats to his life. His house, our house, has been firebombed. At one stage in Taiwan, someone skinned the dog and pinned it on our door. But throughout it all, he kept having this independent editorial, and his staff kept chatting the news of the day. Actually, he was forced to divest in Giordano after one very colourful op-ed piece where he called Li Pang, the butcher of Beijing, a turtle's egg with 0 IQ in the title. Li Pang was premier, and you can imagine that didn't really go down well in China. And so now we fast forward to 2020. After the pro-democracy protests that had happened in Hong Kong in 2019, under the I guess the global pandemic that was happening, Hong Kong passed its national security law. And with the national security law, it was a weapon, a means to bypass our legal system and crack down on all pro-democracy expression. my father and his colleagues were one of the first targets. And I still remember in August of 2020 when 15 to 20 police officers went in our home and took my father away, and then took him and paraded him around his newsrooms, where 200 police officers had been waiting there after raiding the biggest newspaper. Apple Daily was the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong. Since the end of 2020, my father has been in prison. So at 76, he's the oldest political prisoner. He's been in prison for more than 3.5 years now. They raided Apple Daily again, this time with 500 police officers, arresting his colleagues, who are also still in prison, unfortunately. And his trial is currently ongoing. We've seen a real breakdown in the rule of law of Hong Kong. I'll give you an example, tying it back to Tiananmen Square. Hong Kong used to be the only place in any Chinese territory where you could still go to a Tiananmen Square vigil and pay your respect to these students who innocently lost their lives to the army and to tanks. And my dad went to one of the charges he got for lighting a candle and saying a prayer at Tiananmen Square vigil was upwards of a year in a maximum security prison in solitary confinement. And that was, again, for attending a Tiananmen Square vigil. In fact, I remember attending those vigils, so maybe I wouldn't be safe if I went back. I remember sitting there with my family, and I don't know if any of you in attendance had ever been to one, but it's a beautiful moment where you're sat in Victoria Park and it's a nighttime and there's candles being handed around shaped like flowers. And as you're all sat there, you sing these songs. One of the songs' title was The Flower of Freedom. And I'm not going to sing it, but the lyrics go, no matter how hard the rain beats down, the flower of freedom will one day bloom. And as a child, I always wondered, what did that mean? What did the flower of freedom blooming meant? And then I saw the courage that my father and the people of Hong Kong exhibited, standing for what he believed in, standing for what was right, despite the threat to his life, but also to the life of so many people. Look, many of you journalists here and listening and politicians started down this road to give people a better alternative, a truth, so to speak. And for many years, that's what my father and his colleagues did. Apple Daily gave an alternative to the people of Hong Kong, to the news media that was sucked up to the Chinese communist regime. Apple Daily did not do that. And for many years, my father was an example of someone who could be successful in Hong Kong without having to bend the knee to autocrats. And so I realized that it wasn't necessarily so much about just the truth. It was about the courage to stand up, to tell the truth, to be there even though your life might be in danger, even though it might not be the rational thing for you to do. And that's how you make the flower of freedom bloom. And so I ask that all of you here support my father, call for his release, and one day I might see him again. Thank you.
Helen, would you like?
Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's often said, and many of you will have heard this phrase, that journalists don't want to become the story. But we're here today to talk to you about a journalist who has become the story. And we urge all of you in the room to shout his story from the rooftops for the reasons Sebastian has given and for reasons I'm going to go on to give. I have the privilege of leading the international legal team for this remarkable man, 76-year-old Jimmy Lai, working with the brilliant Jennifer Robinson and our colleagues. Jimmy Lai, as you've heard, is a renowned pro-democracy campaigner, a writer, and a media owner since his political awakening due to the bloodshed of Tiananmen Square in 1989. He's a 76-year-old British national who's achieved a huge amount over the decades and is now a prisoner of conscience in this region, in Hong Kong, unjustly imprisoned in Hong Kong for 3.5 years because of his work as a journalist, as a pro-democracy campaigner. He has been imprisoned, make no mistake, for his words, for his writing, and for his newspaper. He's already spent more than 1,180 days in solitary confinement for his words, for his writing, for his newspaper. And he now faces life behind bars for his work. Now, you've just heard incredibly powerful testimony from Sebastian about his father's story. And Sebastian has become a member of the club no one wants to be in, along with some others in the room. And tribute was rightly paid to the brilliant work of Peter Greste. But we're conscious of so many other Australians and Australian families who've ended up in the same position as Sebastian, having to speak out because their loved one is unjustly, arbitrarily detained abroad. Now, of course, it goes without saying that what's at stake for Sebastian could not be higher, because Jimmy Lai, as well as being a brilliant pro-democracy campaigner, writer, newspaper owner, and visionary, is of course also a father and is a grandfather. Sebastian has not seen his father for 3.5 years since he was detained in December of 2020. Sebastian cannot return to Hong Kong to even have a prison visit with his father, precisely because he's speaking in rooms like this to people like you. And for speaking out and leading the Free Jimmy Lai campaign, he himself has been threatened with criminalisation, with prosecution, and has been intimidated by the long arm of the Chinese state across borders. So the risk for Sebastian couldn't be starker. If things don't change, he may never see his father again. But we want today also to tell you why this case is of such vital importance, not just for Sebastian and his family, and indeed not just for Hong Kong, but also for journalism across the globe and for Australians and Australia. Now, I'm going to outline briefly the context and some detail about his case. Then I'm going to turn to why it's such an important case for journalists and journalism, and then finally, why it's such an important case for Australia. First of all, the context and his case. You've heard from Sebastian how in response to the brutal massacre in Tiananmen Square in 1989, Jimmy Lai founded the newspaper Apple Daily, which fast became one of Hong Kong's most popular newspapers and the largest independent Chinese language media outlet in the region. And for Jimmy Lai, access to free and independent information gives people choice, and choice is freedom. Now, from the outset, his newspaper had an unashamed pro-democracy, anti-corruption editorial line. It was also, as some of you may know, innovative and dynamic, combining hard-hitting politics with celebrity gossip, which was unheard of in the Hong Kong media market at the time. For those of you who are British or have a British link, Mary Poppins might say it's a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. But the way Jimmy Lai preferred to put it was that it was really like a dumpling. So you had the pastry and it made you get to the meat inside. But whatever way you think of it, you've got to eat your greens in order to have your sweets, spoonful of sugar, a dumpling. Key point was the same, that you hook people with the celebrity gossip and then you have the hard-hitting politics. And that was completely unheard of in the region at the time. Now, of course, over the years, Apple Daily, like any self-respecting independent newspaper, trod on some very powerful toes. And the authorities hated Apple Daily and Jimmy Lai for that. He became an incredibly powerful and influential voice in Hong Kong and around the world, speaking out for democracy, human rights, against CCP corruption and abuse of power, and became a leading figure in the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. And under his leadership, Apple Daily was a consistent ally to the pro-democracy movement, including its support for the umbrella movement that swept Hong Kong in 2014, which many of you will remember. As activists ceased their protests in 2015, The front page editorial of Apple Daily proclaimed, "We will put away our umbrellas so that one day we can reopen them again." And in Jimmy Lai's own words, he said at the time, "I think it my duty to do whatever I can to support freedom and keep the rule of law here." And that was really what drove him and what drove his journalism and his work. Now, his early experience of seeing his business targeted by Chinese authorities in the way that you've heard from Sebastian, in retaliation for speaking out, helped him to understand why so many fellow businessmen over the decades simply towed Beijing's line and bit their tongues, if you'll forgive the mixed metaphors. It helped him to understand why in 2019 many business people made empty statements against the peaceful protesters, feeling they'd no choice but to show support for the Hong Kong authorities and Beijing when they were pressurised to do so. And Jimmy Lai gave a very powerful interview to the New York Times in 2019 about that and about businessmen's decision to do that, saying that approach was understandable but also a mistake, because China's leaders know that once they cow you, they can always cow you. Once they have you in their pocket, they'll always squeeze you. They were his words. Well, I think it's safe to say Jimmy Lai has certainly not been cowed. He's certainly not in the authorities' pocket. And for that, he's been targeted by the authorities for decades in multiple ways, as you've heard from Sebastian, including being targeted financially, including his home and his business being firebombed, being placed under intimidatory constant surveillance for many years. I'll give you one example of the way in which he was financially squeezed. By 2019, the Chinese Communist Party had squeezed the revenue of both Next Magazine and Apple Daily by pressurising companies not to advertise. Despite it being the second biggest selling daily in the city and the top selling independent in the city rather than state media, by August 2019, not a single Hong Kong company advertised in the newspaper because of the pressure that they were under. So that gives you a sense of the flight of advertisers, meaning a loss of print revenue of about $44 million a year. So a huge range of different tactics were used to try to silence him, to try to stop him speaking truth to power. And we know that he provoked China's ire when, in 2019, he met with a range of politicians around the world, and in a bipartisan way. He met, for example, in the US with Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi during a visit to Washington, D.C. And we also know now that his engagement with 9 countries in particular, including Australia, angered the authorities, because he engaged with Australia, Ireland and a number of other countries around the world to raise very serious concerns about the draconian national security law. And when those countries then decided to suspend their extradition arrangements with Hong Kong because of their concerns, something which Australia did a number of years ago, that has then been used against him in the prosecution. It's suggested somehow in the current trial that that's collusion with foreign forces and damaging Hong Kong's reputation. Because what we've now seen is that in the last 5 years, the most powerful tool of all has been used against Jimmy Lai, the law. We've seen Apple Daily being repeatedly raided, documents being confiscated, the arrests of senior staff, freezing of the newspaper assets. Actually, interestingly, part of the reason why we know what we know, and we've seen some of the footage that we have of the raids on Apple Daily, are because of women journalists, because of a number of women journalists who dashed to the ladies' toilet and frantically released information when the male police officers were rounding people up outside. So one for the women. We've seen him being marched from Apple Daily's newsroom in handcuffs in August 2020, one of the first to be arrested under the controversial authoritarian national security law. And Victoria Tinmore Hui, a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, has said, "It would not be an overstatement to say that the national security law was made for Jimmy Lai." Now, the Apple Daily staff bravely continued to publish until the newspaper was forcibly shut down in June 2021, described by the UK Foreign Secretary as a chilling blow to freedom of expression in Hong Kong, and by Amnesty International as the darkest day for democracy in Hong Kong. And he's faced a barrage of spurious and oppressive prosecutions. And not to put too fine a point on it, what we are seeing in his current trial under the national security law, where he's charged with alleged offences of colluding with foreign forces, as well as under colonial-era sedition laws, what we are seeing is a charge of conspiracy to commit journalism. I'll give you a few examples that we've seen over the opening 5 months of the trial. Factual allegations against Jimmy Lai include, as a newspaper owner, taking steps to secure more subscribers for Apple Daily. One of the prosecution's allegations is, he decided to launch a website in English so that the newspaper could be read by English-speaking subscribers around the world. And you hear it, and Jen and I and others wait for the ... and what follows. But that's it. That's the allegation. So trying to reach more subscribers is criminal in the new Hong Kong. Another ludicrous example is an allegation was made against him that he had reached out to a contact to see if Lord Patton, Chris Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong, would write an opinion piece, an op-ed. So newspaper owner attempts to secure op-ed on issue of public importance is a crime in the new Hong Kong. And that's why we call it conspiracy to commit journalism. It's also conspiracy to raise human rights concerns with human rights organisations and with governments, including the Australian government. Now, in the prosecution opening against Jimmy Lai between December 2023 and January 2024, I can tell you Australia was mentioned 16 times. Repeatedly, allegations have been made against Jimmy Lai that because Australia shares his human rights concerns about the national security law and the degradation of the rule of law in Hong Kong, therefore, he's in a conspiracy with Australia and other countries. So Australia has also been weaponised against Jimmy Lai. Now, the context of this case is a Hong Kong which has changed beyond all recognition in the space of the past decade. May look the same, the trappings look the same, the buildings look the same, but what we've seen is a Hong Kong which is plummeting down the rankings for media freedom. Once a bastion of press freedom in the region, it's now plunged from being in the top 20 in Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Rankings a decade ago to now placing at number 135 of 180 countries, just ahead of South Sudan. Now, that's not surprising when you look at the warnings that were sounded by Australia, by many states around the world, by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, multiple UN experts and specialist NGOs in 2020. Because when the national security law was introduced overnight by Beijing, imposed on Hong Kong, it was described by Amnesty as dangerously vague and broad. Virtually anything could be deemed a threat to national security under its provisions, and it can apply to anyone on the planet. And there were very grave concerns expressed that the national security law, the NSL, would be used to crack down on critics or perceived critics, including civil society and journalism. And those concerns have been proven to be quite right. We've seen over 200 arrests, including dozens of child arrests. It's created a climate of fear in Hong Kong, a Hong Kong in which, as you may have seen in recent weeks, school children who do not sing the national anthem loudly enough can be criticised by the authorities, in which booksellers, pensioners, children's book authors, lawyers, activists and journalists can be rounded up and criminalised at the authorities' whim. And I'll give you a statistic which illustrates just how far Hong Kong has fallen. In June 2019, 5 years ago this month, there were 26 political prisoners in Hong Kong. The most recent figures available from April of this year are that there are now 1,841 political prisoners in Hong Kong. And for those of you who require help with the maths, that's a 7,000% increase in half a decade. Now that puts Hong Kong in a very small number of countries who have a trajectory like that in relation to political prisoners. There's only 2 in the same category, and they are Myanmar and Belarus. So that's the company Hong Kong is now keeping. Now, it's also important to say that while the trial which is ongoing at the moment under the national security law is key, and this is an emblematic case, the newspaper has long closed. So before the national security law trial is even finished, because of the national security law, Apple Daily has already closed. It closed 3 years ago. It's that dynamic, popular, pro-democracy, anti-corruption newspaper, most popular independent Chinese language newspaper in Hong Kong is gone. The printing presses have stopped. It was forced to close after 26 years of operation. after authorities arrested 5 of its senior executives, froze the company's assets. And this happened on the basis of the executive saying that they consider there's reason to believe the company had violated the national security law. So you have a law in which the offences are drafted breathtakingly broadly, essentially criminalises dissent, and you can close the company, hugely successful media business, hugely successful company, at the stroke of a pen by Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee, who at the time was the Secretary for Security, signing a warrant with a letter to the Board of Directors stating he had reason to believe the NSL had been violated. And not to put too fine a point on it, this was state-sponsored theft of a successful media business, state-sponsored theft of a successful company. It's an extreme, chilling demonstration of the Hong Kong authorities' campaign to silence all opposition or perceived opposition voices and use the law to curb dissent. Now, I just want to flag a number of trends which myself and Jennifer and our colleagues see, and why we think that this case is indicative of wider trends across the region and across the world from the autocrat's playbook. There's 3 trends I just want to highlight. The first is, increasingly what I'm seeing in my work is rather than going after individual journalists, repressive regimes are going after media owners in an attempt to take out the entirety of a media ecosystem. Now, Jimmy Lai is a stark example of that. So rather than going after a lowly reporter, if you go after the kingpin, you go after the owner of the newspaper, you can take out the entire newspaper in one fell swoop, which is what indeed has happened. We see that also with my client Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala. Very similar case in many ways in Guatemala, because his newspaper, El Periodico, right from the outset was founded to be anti-corruption, pro-human rights, pro-democracy. And again, he's on trial currently, his newspaper long shut down. My client Maria Ressa in the Philippines, the Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist, again, we see an attempt to go after Maria Ressa as the founder of Rappler and to go after Rappler itself. So this is a new trend. Why take out one individual journalist when you can try to take out the entire system and shut down a media ecosystem? Second trend I want to highlight is what Maria Ressa calls lawfare. So the weaponization of the law to target journalists. And of course, all of you in the room will be familiar with many years of powerful voices attempting to use the law to silence journalists and stop them doing what they do best, treading on powerful toes, speaking truth to power. And usually you see that done through traditional legal tools like defamation, for example, or increasingly national security type laws. But we're now also seeing the creative use of a very wide range of laws against journalists to target them. And chillingly, we're increasingly seeing the use of laws designed to discredit the journalist. So, for example, I mentioned Jose Ruben Zamora. He was charged completely spuriously with fraud. Maria Ressa was charged with being a tax evader. And Jimmy Lai, amongst the barrage of cases he's had to face over the last number of years, it included a wholly spurious fraud charge based on alleged violation of a lease. So that's a new trend that we're seeing, lawfare. And the third trend, which I would highlight, is that we're also seeing an attempt to construct a false narrative in these cases. And China, in this sense, and Hong Kong, has a very close analogy with Iran. So you'll have seen that the Iranian regime, after the Woman Life Freedom protests, has started targeting journalists in a serious way. And in an attempt to say, this is not a grassroots protest about women's rights in Iran, this instead is Western forces acting through Western-funded journalists. So it's only a small number of individuals. That's the kind of argument which is being presented. It's why so many journalists are behind bars in Iran. And we've seen something similar in Hong Kong. So instead of accepting that in 2019, 2020, many of the protests which took place involved 1.7 million people, 1.9 million people, 2 million people, 1/3 of the entire population, they're instead now trying to paint a false narrative. We've seen them also do that with Tiananmen Square. Many of you have probably seen the Simpsons episode where the Simpsons travel to Tiananmen Square and there's a plaque there which says, in this space in 1989, nothing happened. So that's a new trend which we're seeing too. And Jimmy Lai's trial is key to them rewriting history about the protests in 2019, 2020. Now finally, I just wanted to turn to why this is also so important specifically for Australia. The first is that journalism is at risk like never before across the globe, but particularly in this region. And today, Jen and I wrote an opinion piece in the Sydney Morning Herald highlighting that. 5 of the most dangerous countries in the worst 10 in the world to conduct journalism, according to the Reporters Without Borders, are in this region: China, North Korea, Myanmar, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Australia is a key voice in this region, and we ask Australia to stand up for Australian values, for freedom of expression in a region which is under particular threat at the moment. Second, there's a direct interest for Australians in this case in a number of ways. Tens of thousands of Australians are based in Hong Kong. 86,000 people born in Hong Kong have made Australia their home. 900 members of the Australian Chamber of Commerce are based in Hong Kong from 230 different companies. It's why Australia signed the Media Freedom Coalition statement in December 2023, along with 23 other countries expressing serious concern at the undermining of media freedom in Hong Kong. Not to put too fine a point on it, we've seen in Jimmy Lai's case the targeting of a business and the state-sponsored theft of a business. Every single Australian business in Hong Kong is at risk because of the actions that are being taken by the authorities. The third thing I'd highlight is the trial itself. In the trial itself, Australia is being weaponised against Jimmy Lai. I mentioned the multiple references to Jimmy Lai engaging with Australia, and then the ridiculous suggestion that because Australia shares human rights concerns which Jimmy Lai shares, therefore he's somehow in conspiracy with Australia. Australia is one of the foreign forces which the prosecution claim Jimmy Lai is colluding with. Indeed, the prosecution also claim he's colluding with the United Nations by raising human rights concerns with the United Nations. So we're now in a position in the new Hong Kong where the United Nations, despite China being a member of the Security Council, a founder member of the United Nations, the United Nations equals foreign forces in the new Hong Kong. And then fourth and finally, I just want to highlight that we've also seen a direct impact on Australians through the use of the national security law in Hong Kong and here on Australian soil. Just last month, 14 democracy activists were convicted under the NSL, including an Australian citizen. Hong Kong has even issued bounties for the arrest of high-profile activists living here in Australia, including for former legislator Ted Hui and lawyer Kevin Yam, an Australian citizen. Even those on Australian soil are not immune to this threat to media and political freedoms. So that's the backdrop. Now, from our perspective, we today ask that Australia and Australian journalists do what they can to shine a light on this disgraceful story. Many of you may have heard the Desmond Tutu quote from the early 1980s, saying, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So we ask today that Australia is not neutral in the circumstances that we're in. And we ask you to take a page from the bravery that we've seen from Jimmy Lai himself, the bravery of his son, Sebastien Lai, targeted and threatened simply for speaking out for his father, by the bravery of Hong Kongers, so many of whom have made Australia their home, who've spoken truth to power. I'm sure many of you have watched videos of Hong Kongers weeping in the rain as they kept vigil outside Apple Daily's offices on the night of its last printing, how they shone their smartphone lights as makeshift candles captured in the image on Apple Daily's final cover, how they queued up for hours and hours to wait to buy the last copy, because they realised that the last paper that spoke truth to communist power in Hong Kong was dying, and with it, a part of Hong Kong and a part of the free world. Now, what is Hong Kong now becoming? A bay of broken promises, a safe harbour for human rights violators, a dictatorship, an autocracy masquerading as a free market, free trade hub, the finest laundromat for cleaning money in the East, the only international financial capital to hold over 1,800 political prisoners. Lawyers, bankers, international business people wear what Congressman Mike Gallagher called golden blindfolds as they stare out the windows of their glass offices onto Victoria Harbour. But Jimmy Lai, we know, would tell us to commit to our principles and not to give in to despair. And that's why today we ask you to do what you can to shine a light on this disgraceful, emblematic case, to support Sebastian and support Australian values and to stand up for freedom of expression in the region. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for very powerful addresses. Taking up your point about Australia and Australian journalists doing more directly for the case of Jimmy Lai, but also more broadly, I'd just be interested to see if you could talk to that point about what it is that is most powerful at this point of time. I mean, I think I've read you in the Financial Review saying that we shouldn't let our resources trade stand in the way of the big issues, but what is it that practically can be done in this case?
Yeah, sure. So, in cracking down on free press in Hong Kong, the government has essentially made it so that the local media environment is completely quiet. Because once you close the biggest newspaper, it's a pretty clear message to all the other journalists in the region. So essentially, there's no local coverage of Hong Kong, of the day-to-day of what is happening to Hong Kong, and under this guise of oh, nobody's saying anything, so infallibility, so to speak. So what we can't do, we're not doing anything wrong. Hong Kong is committing all these human rights abuses on my father and the other people of Hong Kong. And so as a media, as a journalist in Australia, where it's safe from the long arms, well, not necessarily safe from the long arms of the Chinese state, but much safer. It's important to keep covering it and keep calling it out, because otherwise Hong Kong gets away with saying that we still have the free press. Guess what? That's what they do. Silence is the loudest voice of oppression. They say that, and there's no feedback, and therefore they claim that nobody's speaking out, because everybody that's speaking out is now in prison. They still claim they have the rule of law. And so all these things that they claim, and there's no bounce back from the press, needs to be called out, and they need to be held accountable for what they're doing. On what I said for the Australian Financial Review, I meant, look, it's important to trade with China. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I'm saying that they'll buy your resources when they want to buy your resources, and once it's not good for them to do that, they're not going to do it. Nobody trades out of the goodness of their heart. And so my point was simple, is that you should stand up for your beliefs and not trade an ounce of your people's dignity for what is short-term, a little economical bump that will disappear the moment they decide to not need the resources that you sell them.
Can I just add two quick things? The first thing is, we're going to be asking the Australian government to expressly call for Jimmy Lai's immediate and unconditional release, whether they do that individually or multilaterally with other countries. Now, that's already an international call that many other countries and parliaments have made. So amongst those who've already made that call are the US government, the UK government, both houses of the Canadian Parliament passed unanimous resolutions calling for Jimmy Lai's release, the European Parliament also, and 5 United Nations experts. So this isn't a radical proposal. We're asking Australia to join those other countries which have already done that and taken that step. And it's interesting when you look at the 9 countries in particular that were targeted by the prosecution in the opening, that Australia is not alone, but one of a minority who've yet to call for his release, whereas the majority of them have already done that. The second thing we'd say just practically is, we know that Hong Kong, and indeed the Chinese authorities in Beijing, are very concerned to maintain this facade that Hong Kong is still a safe place to do business. And when I gave that statistic earlier about the number of political prisoners and the company that Hong Kong is keeping, the difference is that I think most people would recognise when you're talking about Belarus or Myanmar that you are dealing with essentially pariah states. But I think with Hong Kong, people still maintain the idea that it's different and that you've one country, 2 systems. Now, we know that they care about that. Chief Executive John Lee, in his first policy speech, spoke about the importance of international investment to Hong Kong. We know there's real leverage there. And in the cases Jen and I do, which involve securing a release of individuals who are arbitrarily detained abroad, which we've acted together, including for a number of Australian citizens, sometimes some countries are very transactional. So Russia or Iran will quite often have a particular prisoner that they want to swap for, or a particular amount of money that they want. China, Hong Kong's a little different. But what all of these cases ultimately come down to is essentially the hassle factor. How can you make it more hassle for the detaining authority to continue its abuse of power in this way, rather than simply letting the person out? And I think we've got someone in the room who benefited from precisely that, with securing the release of Peter from Egypt after he was disgracefully also detained for being a journalist and for doing his job.
Jen, did you want to say something?
Well, I just encourage journalists in this country to cover the case, because keeping a spotlight on Jimmy's case is really important. We saw Hong Kong was at the top of the news stories during the protest movement, but since then, you know, we've had Gaza, we've had other huge international stories, and it's important that we continue to report on these fundamental press cases. I mean, Jimmy Lai's case is I think he's got one of the most inspiring stories in terms of a success story in Hong Kong, a successful businessman who stood up against and spoke truth to power, and he's being targeted for it. And I think it's important that journalists around the world, we've had the unions come out and support, we've got international free speech groups come out and support, and it's important that journalists continue to report upon it. But I want to make clear that our ask of the Australian government is a very modest one. The British government, the US government, our allies have already called for his release. They would be joining their allies in standing up for what's right and standing up for principles that we believe in here in Australia and that we say we stand up for in the region.
Anna Henderson has a question.
Thank you. Just really a follow-up to what Laura was just asking, but what do you think it would say about a government if the decision was made not to heed this call and raise this case?
Yeah, so it depends if that is the belief of the government, essentially. What I'm trying to say is that if a government doesn't believe in what the people of Hong Kong fought for, my father is in prisons for a free press, democracy, and whatnot, and if they don't tell their people that's what they believe, then that's fine. But if you do, and the only reason why you're not calling it out is fear of another, of China, so to speak, or of Hong Kong, then by definition, the Chinese have essentially taken your free speech. And so if that is your belief, if that is fundamentally what your country is built on, there is a moral responsibility to call out all these breaches in human rights in Hong Kong.
I think it goes beyond that. Australia has made clear that our relationship with China will not be sacrificed, and our values, our Australian values of free speech and democracy will not be sacrificed for the relationship, and that we will be willing to raise it. Prime Minister Albanese made that clear before the Premier's visit recently. And so this case is falls straight within the bounds of that conversation. This is about free speech, this is about democracy, this is something that the Australian government can and should be raising, and we shouldn't allow concern about the relationship. We have to continue to stand up for these values in the context of all of our diplomacy, and that's what the Australian government say they would do, and that's what they can and should do in this case.
Can I just add that we're very grateful for what Australia has done already. So I mentioned the Media Freedom Coalition statement, 24 states from around the world that Australia signed at the end of December 2023, raising concerns about the undermining of free speech in Hong Kong and expressly referring to Jimmy Lai's case and also Stan News. We're grateful for that. Jen and I and Sebastian, in our engagement with the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, have seen Australia as a great ally. Australia, for example, supported an event earlier this year which was focused on transnational repression, including the actions of the Hong Kong authorities against individuals around the world, including Australians. So we're grateful for the support so far, and what we're now asking for this week, we say, is completely in line with that trajectory, what Australia's already done. We're now asking them to go one step further with this modest request to join the requests which have already been made by others for Jimmy Lai to be immediately and unconditionally released.
Daniel Hurst.
Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. This is to the whole panel, but probably starting with you, Sebastian, if you wouldn't mind. I'd like to find out your view of the role of Australian judges in the Hong Kong court system. You've given we've heard today about the trajectory of the rule of law, the weaponisation of the justice system, or the weaponisation of the law in Hong Kong. Do you have a message for Australian judges about whether they should continue to serve in the Hong Kong judicial system? And to what extent do you sympathise or understand the view of someone like Patrick Keane, who said last year that the quarter-final appeal has had a record of success in upholding the rule of law, and he said that it was better to play a role than to vacate the field.
So, look, Hong Kong has 1,800, more than 1,800 political prisoners. And these political prisoners are there for their pro-democracy protests. So, I mean, I guess it's a very easy metric if we think about it that way. Has the multiple judges sitting in the Hong Kong courts, Australian judges, has them being sitting judges stopped the people of Hong Kong from being oppressed, from being arrested for something that is very much legal in their home country? It obviously hasn't, right? So we're in a situation where multiple judges have left recently. Two UK judges, one Canadian, and Beverly McLaughlin have left, and actually Lord Sumpton, the UK judge, said in an interview afterwards the reason why he left, saying that look, he wanted to stay and have a look at how the national security laws play out, but now it's become so oppressive that he couldn't stay. And that is the situation where we're in. So by staying, you're essentially saying that, well, there's still some a semblance of rule of law in this place that imprisons pro-democracy protesters. And that is not true. That is not true at all. And you could see that with all the people who are voting with their feet.
Could I just add to that? Thanks for the question. I think it's a really important one. And just at the outset, I want to make clear that I entirely understand that many foreign judges around the world who sit in Hong Kong have grappled with their consciences over the last number of years. And I entirely understand that many of them have formed the view that they can make things better by being there, or they can show solidarity with their fellow judges domestically, for example. I'm also conscious of the other view that by being present, it gives a fig leaf of due process to a system which has become profoundly unfair. And of course, with the national security law, foreign judges can't sit in national security law cases because the system doesn't trust them to sit in national security law cases. I mean, my personal view falls on the line of all of the UK sitting judges who a number of years ago resigned en masse, with Lord Reid, the President of the UK Supreme Court, explaining that he felt that the change in the system in Hong Kong meant they could no longer in good conscience continue to sit. And I also share the views of Lord Sumption, who very recently expressed his view. I'm also conscious that a number of judges have left quietly. So Sebastian mentioned Beverly McLaughlin from Canada. It's also Lady Hale, Brenda Hale from the UK, both of whom chose not to renew and to leave. So my personal view is leaning towards the view that actually continuing to sit causes a problem. But I entirely respect and understand that the people who are remaining may be remaining for good reason, even if my view is that it's a misguided reason.
Thank you.
Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and also board member here at the Press Club. Question for the three of you. Jen, obviously last week had a very big week securing Julian Assange's release. How much, though, does it sort of make it difficult for Western countries to sort of advocate for press freedom, to release detained journalists with people like Peter Grester or Chung Lai in regimes which we would characterise it generously as not democratic, and a whole lot more? How much does it make it difficult to advocate on behalf of those cases when Western governments pursue journalists like Julian or whistleblowers, as we're seeing with David McBride and things like that? Do we lose our moral power of persuasion in those cases?
I'm happy to address that. That's what we were saying for many years with respect to Julian Assange, that if the United States is going to seek to prosecute and pursue an award-winning Australian journalist, what message does that send to the rest of the world? And we know that Chinese officials were raising Julian's case repeatedly, calling out the United States, saying, look at what they're doing to the Julian Assange, there is no free speech in the United States, while at the same time imprisoning Jimmy Lai and trying to send him to prison for the rest of his life. And so I think the resolution of Julian Assange's case shows not just the power of Australian diplomacy and the importance, the important role that Australia can play both in Julian Assange's case, in Cheng Li's case, and assisting us to negotiate Julian's release and return. That's important, and I hope that will open the way for better conversations. We know that Julian Assange's case is also raised, for example, in the context of Evan Gershkovich in Russia, where you've got Russia prosecuting a US journalist under espionage laws. This is setting a dangerous precedent, but I also hope the fact that we were able to negotiate Julian's release gives hope to others, including in this case, that if we can negotiate his release from the most powerful country in the world, then we can do it in other cases, and hopefully next in Jimmy Lai's case.
Could I add something quick on that? I entirely agree, obviously, with what Jen has said. I mean, I'll just make 3 points. First is that this was perceived, Julian Assange's case was perceived as being intractable by many, and actually, ultimately, a diplomatic solution was reached between multiple governments. So I think that's a really inspiring kind of basis, really, for you starting your trip to Australia, Sebastian. Second thing is, I agree with you with the purpose of the question about the hypocrisy. And quite often, I've acted as an international human rights lawyer for 25 years. I'm Irish, as you may be able to tell from my accent, but based in the UK. And I've lost track of the number of times when you'll be negotiating in a case and people will say, well, you're based in London, and how do you explain the UK's position on X, Y, or Z? So you might remember a few years ago, the UK government using the phrase, and we're going to breach international law in a limited and specific way. And then they ended up being trolled by, the Chinese embassy, the Iranian embassy, and so on. And that was a phrase which was thrown in our face in multiple cases. At the time, I was representing 5 people who were imprisoned in Iran. And in engagement, people constantly said, well, how are we supposed to be held to account for this when actually the UK does the same thing? But the third point then is, I think one of the risks that we've seen to journalism in the last number of years has been that phrases which are used by democratic governments are then weaponized by autocratic governments. So when, for example, the Trump administration, when Trump referred to journalists as the enemies of the people and the fake news media, we started seeing that language being echoed by autocratic regimes. So actually, Jimmy Lai's case is a reminder that we need to value journalism here and in Western countries too, because otherwise we see the attacks on journalists being weaponized in a very egregious way and the same language being echoed by autocratic regimes.
Yeah, just add to that. I mean, obviously, these two will know much better than I do about the broader landscape of journalists being persecuted. But in my father's case, I've just been very moved by the moral clarity that many states have shown, and I think part of it is because of this. It's a pretty straightforward case of someone who sacrificed everything he has to stand up for what he believes is right. As a man who could have left at any point. But decided to stay with the people of Hong Kong and the people and its journalists. So, I just wanted to add that. It's just, I've been incredibly grateful.
Thank you.
Peter Gerster.
Thanks very much. Peter Grester from the Alliance for Journalist Freedom at Macquarie University. Caoilfhionn, you outlined and articulated the allegations or against Jimmy Lai, and you explained how Australia cropped up repeatedly in those allegations. Are you concerned that Australian advocacy may end up confirming that kind of conspiracy of collusion? Are you concerned that it may in fact complicate the way the campaign to get him out? And I'm the finest press club tradition, I'm going to ask a second question. Again, Jimmy, it's a thing that families wrestle with all the time, that their own advocacy might in fact make things worse for the loved ones who are imprisoned. Is that something that concerns you?
Okay, so just taking the second point first, and then I'll come back to the other one, and I know Sebastian will also want to add something on that. In short, no. The current situation couldn't be starker for Jimmy Lai. He's 76. He's already been in prison for 3.5 years. He faces life behind bars under the national security law. The likely minimum sentence would be in the region of 10 years, which given his age, may well be a life sentence anyway. So what we're currently facing is the risk of a journalist dying behind bars for being a journalist, indeed a British national dying behind bars. And in those circumstances, the view which we and our clients have taken is, in fact, that keeping quiet and hoping that backroom quiet diplomacy will resolve matters is not the way to go. And while there is, of course, a risk, as there is in all of these cases, that by speaking out By speaking out, you may make things worse. It's a risk which we have to take. And I've got to say, I was inspired amongst many things by the very powerful letter which you wrote, I think in 2013, early 2014, Peter, when you were imprisoned in Egypt, where I imagine you were facing a very similar dilemma about, do I keep quiet and hope it can get resolved, or do I speak out? And the view which I know you took at the time was that you speak out and you call out what's happening. That's the view Jimmy Lai has taken, and that's the view we've taken. In terms of confirming the conspiracy, that issue, well, I think on that, the difficulty is that the NSL is drafted in such a way that basic engagement, raising human rights concerns, equals collusion with foreign forces, equals secession, and equals a crime under the national security law. And if we were to use that as the yardstick for our advocacy, we could say nothing at all. So our view is, again, that on that issue, we've got to call it out, Australia's got to call it out, and actually ultimately we think what's likely to result in a change to the current trajectory in Jimmy Lai's case is going to be international pressure. And we think Australia is a key part of that.
You know, obviously there is consequences to speaking out against autocratic regimes. And sometimes it keeps me up at night, you know, what they're doing to my father. But if we don't speak out, then we let these dictators get away with doing whatever they want. I mean, that's the whole point of journalism, right? You need to speak out. You need to tell the truth, even though it's not the easy thing short term, because you trust that long term, it wins out. And it's only by speaking out to my father that one day I might see him again.
Ben Westcott.
Hi, Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thanks so much for coming to Australia, Sebastian. I was in Hong Kong during the 2019 protests working as a journalist, so it's great to have you here. I just wanted to ask, personally, how is your father doing at the moment in jail? And just to you, and of course to Ms. Gallagher as well, is he expected to take the stand in his own defence during the trial?
So my father is, as you heard, 76. He recently couldn't attend court because he was too sick, but then he attended afterwards. Look, truth be told, I haven't been back in 3 years, more than 3 years, because I speak out on his behalf, so I haven't seen him. In fact, the first time I saw a picture of him in the last 3.5 years was when Associated Press managed to capture a picture of him when he was exercising. And, you know, it's sort of this bittersweet moment of well, seeing like, oh, I guess he's still there, right? He's flanked by 2 guards. He's skinnier, darker, but he's still him. He's still my father. I think he knows he's doing the right thing, and I know that that gives someone a lot of strength. But yeah, I mean, given his age, the situation could change very quickly at any time. Regarding taking the stance, I don't know, frankly. I don't have contact with the local Hong Kong legal team because of the political climate in Hong Kong, and because I choose to speak out on his behalf.
I'll just add something. First of all, on his condition, he's 76. He's also diabetic. He's been in solitary confinement, as I said, since December 2020. Many of you will know that being in solitary confinement has an increased risk of morbidity, and there's a series of associated health risks. It's why, as a matter of international law, and our colleague at Doughty Street, an associate academic expert, Juan Mendez, who's the former UN Special Rapporteur on torture, identified 14 days as the maximum ordinarily that you should be held in solitary confinement. Once you hit 15 days, it's prolonged solitary confinement. Very serious concerns under international law, being held in prolonged solitary confinement. I mean, he's clearly been in for a vast multiple of that. So that raises very serious concerns for us too. So it's his age, it's his underlying health conditions, and it's the fact that he continues to be in solitary confinement. And look, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Many of you will know that there's a precedent for someone winning the Nobel Peace Prize in a Chinese prison and dying in prison. And we are very, very concerned. And that's why there's a real urgency to this. And it's difficult for us to speak about this with Sebastian here, but you know, his father's 76. We are deeply, deeply concerned for his safety and his well-being. I can't answer the question on him taking the stand, I'm afraid. That's obviously a matter which is under review at the moment. But if it helps on the timing, there's going to be a halfway point submission because we've reached the end of the prosecution case. Now there's a whole series of dates when they're hearing mitigation for the 47. But at the end of July, there's going to be a submission of no case to answer. So that's the defence making an argument that even if you take the prosecution case at its height, there's not enough to justify a conviction. And assuming that fails, we'll then be moving on to the defence case. So if he did take the stand, it's possible that that could happen around August. Now this is important because one of the tactics that we've seen the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities use repeatedly, I know many of you in the room will have seen it, is key things happen at a time when the world is looking away. So, for example, the spurious fraud charges landed on Thanksgiving and on the day when Rishi Sunak was being made Prime Minister in the UK. We think what we're looking at is if he were to take the stand, it would likely be when people are on holidays. And if he were to be convicted, we think it may coincide with the US presidential election. So we think the timing is looking like that. So I just say that because it's all the more important that we continue to shine a light, because we know this is a tactic. Egypt does it all the time, as Peter will know, listing hearings on the 26th of December, for example, when the world is busy. So these are tactics autocratic regimes use, and as journalists, and indeed as human rights lawyers, we've got to spot them and ensure that the world is not looking away at key times.
Tessa Conoman.
Thank you all for your time today. One for you, Jen. The plea deal was made after a warning the US would lose its extradition fight. Why did Julian plead guilty? Was it because he was afraid that the outcome could be possibly worse?
Well, if you look at the prospects for Julian Assange, it was either winning the extradition case in the UK, and we had a very good shot at that because of the free speech concerns that were highlighted in the case. The fact that as an Australian citizen, as a foreign citizen, he wouldn't be granted First Amendment protections, was very unlikely to. So either going to the United States, where the medical evidence showed that he would be caused to commit suicide, and to a country where the CIA had plotted to kidnap and kill him. But if we'd won the case, then he'd only be protected from extradition from the United Kingdom, and that indictment still would have been at large, and he could have been extradited from any other country around the world. So the resolution through the plea deal was a way for him to win his freedom immediately and be able to come home to see his family. And that's a very rational choice. And I want to make clear, it doesn't make a precedent. It doesn't set a judicial precedent. This is not a court decision. It doesn't have any presidential value in that sense in the United States. Had he been extradited to the United States and fought it through the courts, we don't know what the US Supreme Court would have found. The case law is that as a foreign citizen, you don't get First Amendment protections. That would have set a terrible precedent. But the chilling effect of this prosecution is what's setting a dangerous precedent. So journalists should be under no illusions that this is a prosecutorial strategy that the US has pursued. They insisted on the particular charge that you see in the plea deal, which is conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act for having communications with a government source, receiving and publishing evidence of US war crimes, wrongdoing, and human rights abuse. That is journalism.
Nick Stewart.
Thank you. Still on Assange, he did the plea deal, as you say. We haven't resolved the fact of the possibility of extraterritorial jurisdiction of American law. It's quite possible that, again, someone could publish something in Australia that could be perfectly legal by Australian standards, but they could be hauled in front of a US court. Do you believe that we need a protection for journalists publishing here in Australia so that that can be prevented?
You make an excellent point. So the US was exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction over Julian Assange, published truthful information about the United States outside of the United States, is not a US citizen, has no obligations to the United States. The US exercises criminal jurisdiction because of their notion of harm caused to the United States. And I want to make very clear, as we saw in court in Saipan and in the plea deal, the US could not identify one individual deserving of restitution who suffered actual harm as a result of WikiLeaks publications. But you still have the US exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction while denying you, as foreign citizens who are acting outside the United States, First Amendment protections. That is a dangerous precedent, and it sends a dangerous precedent to countries like China and Hong Kong who purport to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction under this national security law. So yes, Jimmy Lai is being prosecuted inside Hong Kong, but they are saying that they could prosecute anyone anywhere in the world for violating the national security law, including Sebastian, Caoilfhionn, myself, for the work that we're doing. And so I think we have to push back against that. That requires law reform, I believe, in the United States, better protections for journalists, repealing the Espionage Act, but it requires law reform in different countries around the world. And what the US has done is set a dangerous precedent that we're seeing roll out in other countries, including by China and Hong Kong.
I suppose the sort of final irony is that that's actually a more chilling idea in a way. That extraterritoriality is a more chilling thing for global media than what China might do internally in Hong Kong. If the Chinese decided to start making the same case, that people would be really horrified, but somehow it hasn't been regarded as so terrifying because it's the US, and there's still this idea that there's a rule of law. Thank you all for speaking to us today. Please thank Sebastien Lai, Caoilfhionn Gallagher.